And so that puts a lot of other pressure on our economy, on our growth, and ultimately on the quote unquote entitlements. Remember, we're not entitled to anything, but Social Security and Medicare, because those are the types of things that take up nearly 2/3 of the overall budget and are going to be insolvent if nothing is done. Hello, welcome to this week's economy. I'm your host, Dr. Vance Ginn. Thank you for joining me today. Well, today we mark the inauguration of Donald J. Trump as President of the United States. He was the 45th president. Now he's the 47th president. And so we need to talk about what he's going to do within the first 100 days. This is really crucial in shaping the path of prosperity through executive actions, strong leadership, and strategic pressure on Congress. This period could see bold moves to cut government spending, unleash energy potential, and create opportunities for workers and businesses. I hope that you will take this, share it with your friends and family, because this is really something that we need to know, not only in the first 100 days, but over the next 4 years, okay? So let's get right to it. Number one, tackle inflation by cutting spending. Persistent inflation has been all around us ever since COVID and everything else, when the government spent way too much money, ran up deficits and debt, and then the Federal Reserve printed money, and we had too much money chasing too few goods. And so this was always going to be persistent inflation, which was always my view on this. And what we've seen is that even expanded upon during the Biden administration of more spending and more deficits and debt and more money printing by the Fed. They started to rein some of that back now. But if we continue to see federal spending explode under the Trump administration, we will have the Fed buy more of that debt, print more money, and we will see more inflation. I'm not as worried about the Trump tax cuts causing inflation as I am the spending. Remember, the ultimate problem of government is how much it spends, not much at how it taxes. But, in the wake of the pandemic, we saw federal spending skyrocket from $4.5 trillion in 2019 to over $6.5 trillion in 2020. And it's still up around that now, as we saw some up and down and some volatility over that period of time. Look, I think what Trump can do is, in those executive orders in the first 100 days, is he can immediately freeze unnecessary expenditures, have OMB look at this, and direct federal agencies to identify redundant programs for cuts. Additionally, Congress must pass a long-term budget cap linking future spending growth to inflation and population increases. These moves will significantly improve fiscal discipline, reduce deficits, and create a solid foundation for tax cuts and deregulation. That's what I hope we see. And with Department of Government Efficiency, look at Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. They have an extraordinary opportunity to bring down spending, bring down regulations. And I think that's going to be a part of what Trump must do, is to put more pressure on Congress to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to bring down government spending. We've got to do that, or we're going to continue to down this bad path overall. Number two, open up energy exploration. And when you look at Biden's energy executive order and the last minute flurry of executive actions that he's done, he's basically made offshore drilling illegal. And that's unfortunate, because what America needs is more energy over time to allow for more abundance across the economy. And so I think this is a terrible move. And it's one that, since that was an executive order by Biden, we need Trump to come in with his executive order and get rid of it. So that way there can be drilling on offshore production. There can be other things like the Keystone XL pipeline. There could be other things like the Anwar production. I mean, there's a lot of energy supply that's out there. There's abundance there, if you will. We just need prices and the markets to work their magic. That's where things happen the best, when people can innovate versus government trying to come in and tell them what they can and cannot do. We don't need to do that. In fact, we should make energy great again. That's a big part of the energy independence, and we can restore U.S. energy dominance by looking at these effects and removing government regulations and other sort of barriers that are keeping us from being as prosperous as possible. And I think that's going to be a big part of those first 100 days, if not just the first couple of days, is really removing a lot of those barriers on the energy side. I think that will be historic there, okay? Number three, get Americans back to work. The current labor landscape, it shows that the unemployment rate is low, but labor force participation rate remains below the pre-pandemic levels, with far too many Americans still sidelined from the workforce. And I think a part of this needs to be fixing the social safety nets. We have too many people that are dependent on government programs instead of having the dignity and respect that comes with work. There's a lot of people still sitting on the sidelines. And yes, some people will hit me and say, well, the prime age, 25 to 54-year-old prime age employment population ratio is back up to where it was before COVID. And so people are getting back to work. But what about the 16 to 24-year-olds? What about those that are over 55 who are not quite on Social Security or in retirement age? We still need to worry about them as well. When you include all of them in the labor force, we're not seeing their return. And so that puts a lot of other pressure on our economy, on our growth, and ultimately on the quote unquote entitlements. Remember, we're not entitled to anything but Social Security and Medicare, because those are the types of things that take up nearly 2/3 of the overall budget and are going to be insolvent if nothing is done. I really think we should look at lowering the retirement age to something like 50 or 55 and making it to where everyone below that will get on private savings accounts or something along those lines. HSAs for Medicare and Medicaid, I think, should move to HSA block grant program as well. And if we do that sort of thing, we can allow for there to be more innovation, for markets to really work, and for incentives to better align in the healthcare sector, in the savings sector, and investments all across the economy instead of government leading the way and crushing a lot of this stuff and making it more harmful in the process. So there's a lot of things that need to be done in that space. Number 4, unleash free markets. We got to build on the last term success of the President Trump's administration, where really what you could do is, President Trump saved an estimated $200 billion annually through deregulation. And his second term must build on this success. What we've seen under the harmful Biden era regulations is about $1.8 trillion in new regulations, which are really just hidden taxes on all of us, right? Because it's passed on in the form of higher prices, lower wages, fewer jobs, just like corporate taxes and everything else. These regulations do stifle economic growth and innovation and ultimately harm Americans in the process. And so I think we've got to overcome that. We also need a better regulatory review process. One of the things that I think is really, instrumental, innovative in this sense, could be a regulatory budget where you look and see how many pages of regulations that there are, reduce the number of regulations, not just a 1 in, 2 out or 1 in, 5 out. But I also think we need to look at the net cost of those regulations, like OIRA and OMB does, CEI. There's some other groups out there that are looking at this. James Brohl are looking at the net cost of regulations. What I would like to see is the federal government, including state governments, is to have a regulatory budget and have some sort of regulatory limit, like a spending limit or a monetary rule. We need fiscal, regulatory, monetary rules to keep these politicians and bureaucrats in check, because otherwise bureaucrats and politicians run the economy instead of the people in the marketplace. And that's who we really want to do this. Number 5, expand free trade. Rising costs burden Americans, and that's exactly what tariffs are. There's more discussion about having an external IRS basically to collect those tariffs. But you could change the name of it, but we shouldn't be growing government, for one thing, because this is a whole lot of government problems to begin with. But also, tariffs are a tax on Americans. We pay those taxes when we import things. So just changing the name of whoever is collecting it doesn't change the fact that these are taxes paid by Americans, and ultimately we will fill the cost. Look, Trump trade wins. Look, he did such thing as we're negotiating the USMCA for the NAFTA to the USMCA, which I think is actually worse in many respects. But leaving that to the side, there were some negotiations that took place, including with China. I don't think that that's because of tariffs, though. I think that's because of the individuals and the groups meeting together and coming up with new ideas. And in fact, when you look at the tariffs and you look at the China trade deal and everything else from the first administration of the Trump administration, Trump presidency, right, in the 45th, then you didn't actually see any changes from China on their trade practices, on their economic growth and everything else. And so I think instead that's where we really need to come out with a free trade agreements over tariffs, especially with our allies. If we do that, we put more pressure on those countries like China to improve their trade practices and improve their policies internally, because otherwise they don't really have much incentive, if any, to do that. And so I think removing tariffs will really empower American businesses and individuals to thrive globally and reduce costs for American families. That's the way that we can let people prosper, okay? And number 6, restore sound money. We need a monetary policy makeover. I'll put it out there. Look, I think we should end the Fed. There was no reason to create a central bank back in 1913, where they were created to be a lender of last resort. And unfortunately, they become a lender of first resort, bailing out banks, increasing the money supply tremendously, buying all the government debt and basically bailing the Congress out of their bad decisions of too much spending. We've got to get away from that. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet still remains at $7 trillion, 75% higher than what it was before the COVID situation. And then you look at where we were before the great financial crisis, the Great Recession back in '08, they were only at 6%, about $800 billion on the balance sheet, 6% of GDP compared to the 25% of GDP today. Instead, we should be shifting to a rules-based policy that I think President Trump should advocate for. He likes to use a lot of pressure on the Fed, and that's, okay. But there's not a lot you could do because they're quote unquote independent, even though there's a lot of dependency between the two. But putting a rule on the Federal Reserve and pushing Congress to impose that rule, I think will be much better. I kind of like the Taylor rule that looks at the trade-offs in the economy, or a Federal Reserve balance sheet rule. There's also nominal GDP targeting, which I have some issues with. But I think by moving to a rules-based policy, we'll be in a much better position than the discretionary nonsense that we see today, where the Federal Reserve's core responsibility should be maintaining price stability. They also should get rid of the dual mandate of full employment and all of that nonsense and just focus on price stability, which is the only thing the Federal Reserve can control. So Trump's second term begins with a clear mandate: get government out of the way and let people prosper. The time to act is now. The clock starts today. Let's make it count. Let's work together to let people prosper, okay? Thanks you for joining me on this episode of This Week's Economy. For more insights, visit vanceginn.com and even get greater value with a paid subscription to my Substack newsletter at vanceginn.substack.com. I thank you for joining me every day. God bless you and let people prosper.